I'm glad you're glad I'm here. And I hope you're glad that I'm glad that you're glad that I'm glad that, yes.
Everybody here is glad.
But you're more glad that I'm glad that
Carl, I was glad you're moving on. Or no, I mean the lesson.
moving from that point, moving on from being glad. Carl's more glad that I'm glad, and J.E.'s glad that Carl's glad that we're moving on. Anybody else glad for anything? Add to the list? It's loosely relevant to our lesson this morning. Loosely. Which is a little bit more than loosely related to last lesson from Wednesday, where we looked at beware of the Pharisee, or the leaven of the Pharisees. The lesson was titled Beware of the Pharisees. This lesson, we're going to be looking at beware of materialism. Our text is Luke 12, beginning in verse 13, going down through verse 34. And like I said a couple lessons ago, we're in an extended period of Luke. I guess Luke 10 through Luke 18 is almost completely uninterrupted, covers several lessons. Some questions to kick us off, some thought questions, just food for thought. How many of you, or how many of us, would like to be successful, or want to be successful, or would welcome the idea of being successful in a professional sense of some kind? Your job, a hobby, whatever it may be. I don't know of anybody that would outright, shun success. The idea of success is somebody said, hey, you want success? And they said, no, I don't really want success. Depending on how we interpret that anyway. What if you were so successful that you had to start opening businesses or new branches or whatever all across the country? Start a business. I admire people that try to do that. Success, have to open another one. And they open another one. Success continues. You keep opening until you've got businesses all across the country. What if you were so famous you had to start traveling all over the world? What if you were able to own a vacation home to every one of these places even? You go all across the world, you have a home in every one of these places. Is there anything wrong with any of this? Well, think about that. That's going to play a role in what we're going to be looking at here this morning. Is there anything, and I've started to kind of shy away from asking that question in general, is there anything wrong with that? Because I think that's not the only question that we should ask. Is there anything right with something is another question that we should ask. But nevertheless, is there anything wrong with being successful, being rich, being even famous, I guess? So recap real quick. Jesus was in Judea now. He had started to move into Perea, or will start to move into Perea. He had just finished eating with that Pharisee at the Pharisee's house and those other scribes. We saw in Luke 12, verse 1, that thousands of people, so many thousands of the people had gathered to him. And he had just finished talking about a few things, like they need to beware of the Pharisees. He talked about how much he loves them. He talks about how they could gain eternal life. And all of a sudden, as he was teaching, a man from the audience comes up and interrupts him. And that sort of sets the stage to what we're going to see in this text. So let's start reading in Luke 12, beginning in verse 13. We'll read the first 3 verses to start us off here. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So this sort of sets the context. Jesus is talking. If you have a red letter Bible, or if you mark in your Bible like I have to try to mark those, sayings of Jesus, you'll notice that pretty much this whole chapter so far is read, and then all of a sudden someone in the crowd comes and says to Jesus, demands something of Jesus even, maybe requests, asks him, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, this is not the kind of request we normally have seen people approach Jesus with, is it? Have women and men asking on behalf of their children, heal my son or my daughter or my servant, or people bringing them to Jesus. Whatever you're willing to do, will you help us, and things like that. We may have even heard by now, or we will at least hear cries like, have mercy on me, son of David, or save me, save us, or things like that. Not at this point have we seen somebody just, up and shout from the crowd something like this. Tell my brother to do something. Tell him to divide the inheritance with me. How do you think Jesus felt about that interruption? Just a thought. Do you think? It's a do you think question, so those are the best kind because there's no wrong answer. Okay, he probably thought, somebody's not listening. Yeah, he's preoccupied. Head's in the wrong place.
But he felt like Jesus was somebody of importance, that he carried weight, like his brother might respect Jesus' word enough to actually...
Yeah, there are some implications, some things we can infer from the fact that this man did this. Not just about the man. Those are all negative inferences, I would say, with the sole exception being that he at least recognized that Jesus is somebody that could maybe do something. But what that something was, that marks the end of any positive side of the inferences about him. But it does imply some things about Jesus. He must have really attracted and moved people with his, his whole persona or what he was saying and doing. He moved people. Even men like this who were totally off base, and not getting the spiritual message that they should be, he still recognized, hey, this Rabbi Jesus, he gave this man the impression that he had some power or authority or influence, sway. So he had an impression on this man, just not the right one. He wants to enlist Jesus as his champion. It's just the fact that what kind of champion was totally off, totally on the opposite side of where it should be. There's another thing that we need to take into consideration, because Jesus' response might sound a little, at best unrelated. Not his immediate reaction, his response, but in verse 15. It might sound like it's unrelated, or it may even sound harsh.
Yeah, to me it did, just because I was thinking, I took it like his brother was supposed to be, even if he was the oldest brother, like, I don't know, I feel like his brother was, I took it like his brother was supposed to be giving him at least some of it, and his brother was like, no, I'm keeping it all, and so he was being wronged, so I wouldn't necessarily consider that greedy, to be like, I just want the part I'm supposed to get.
Yeah, here we have a cultural divide that we can't really relate to this the way they would have, and the way they dealt with these things in that time. Alfred Edersheim makes the point that not only did Jesus not have any legal authority to do anything anyway, of course this man wouldn't have realized that, because if he had, he wouldn't have tried. But he makes the other point that the Jewish law of inheritance was so plain and clearly defined. I mean, there's no getting it wrong. There's no misconstruing it. That if this person had a good cause, if he was a victim here of an actual injustice, he would have had no need to appeal to Jesus, because there were already things implemented to help a man in that position. He wouldn't have had to come to Jesus. The implication is he doesn't have help from anywhere else. He's got to come to Jesus. So it must have been, Edersheim concludes, covetousness that motivated him. he, I guess, was entitled or had already been allotted his rightful portion, whether he was the older brother or the younger brother. If he was the older brother, he may be demanding that he get some of the younger brothers, even though the older brother already gets more. Or if he was the younger brother, he may have been demanding that they split the portion extra that he gets. The fact that he's coming to Jesus with this would imply that he didn't have good motives. He was not right in this request. Now, I would say Jesus wouldn't have helped anyway, because that would have been the wrong message. That is not what Jesus is, that has nothing to do with what Jesus is doing, or getting involved in family affairs or any petty human affairs like that. Whether the man was in the right or in the wrong, if he was in the right, then he would have probably recommended, you need to go see the people that that's their job, that is the tribunals or whatever they have established to take care of that. And it also is implied by Jesus' remark in verse 15, that covetousness had something to do with this, or else where did the covetousness come from? I mean, did Jesus just say verse 14 to the man and then totally change subject and go back to teaching like nothing ever happened? Or is what he says in verses 15 and following directly related to this man, what just happened?
He could know his heart. He knows, he would be able to, Jesus would know if he was.
Yeah. It seems what's implied is that it would have been unheard of for any Jewish person, Jewish man, to do what this man just did. They would never come to a rabbi and demand, even if they had been wronged, they're not going to come to a rabbi, a famous rabbi, a popular rabbi, to do that. They would go to the things that have already been established for them to go and make that appeal. So Jesus' statement and parable is directly in response, just like he always does. We've seen him do this so many times. Somebody throws a monkey wrench into his teaching, a total curveball, and he doesn't get, thrown off. He doesn't get flustered. He doesn't get irritated or annoyed. And he doesn't even ignore it. He uses it as a teaching opportunity. And that's exactly what he does here. He takes this opportunity, this unexpected, unforeseen interruption, and he goes with it to teach. First he tells the man, I got nothing to do with that. It's not my place. That's not my, I don't have the authority or the whatever to do that.
That's almost what he always does when he's asked a question, though.
What's that?
He turns it into a teaching opportunity.
Yeah.
He doesn't just answer a question, he turns it into a teaching opportunity.
Yeah, for everybody. Yeah, see, verse 14 says, he said to him, this is not for me. This is not for me to do for you. And then he turns to them. It says he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. And then in verse 16, and he told them a parable. Well, them would include that man too. But he's talking to everybody again. But not, like I said, not turning right back to where he was and starting where he left off after verse 12. But he's using what this man just brought up to teach a lesson, which a lot of people would consider inappropriate or politically incorrect. Because here's this man, and you're putting him into disrepute or shame. What's that?
Making an example.
Yeah, making an example. And since when is making an example wrong, But a lot of people think that shouldn't do that. Well, Jesus didn't think so. And it wasn't overly direct in a way that would unjustly shame this man, embarrass him over much, but as much as needed to be. Like Paul said later to the church, certain situations, you need to do things that will, in order to put people to shame. You don't want to operate in a way, very careful way necessarily specifically in order to not shame them. Paul said you need to do it in order to shame them, but how much shame and to what end, what aim is the main key there. So Jesus is going to teach, and this lesson needed to be heard by this man as much as anybody else in that audience, if not more.
It's just also another example of what we want and what we feel like we need is very often not actually what's good for us, and God knows.
Yeah.
Knows what's best for us.
Notice Jesus doesn't, whether or not the man is in the right or wrong in that particular dispute is irrelevant to Jesus. He doesn't question it. It doesn't matter. It makes no difference. And I think we're going to see in the lesson that he ultimately not even ultimately, the lesson he immediately says in verse 15, teaches in verse 15, would seem to indicate that in actuality it didn't even matter. The lesson would still apply whether that man had been wronged or was trying to wrong his brother, whether he'd been wronged by his brother and his father or whether he was trying to wrong his brother, the lesson would stand all the same. So here's, yeah.
That man sort of reminds me of that commercial, "It's my money and I want it now." And if you've heard that one, and it sort of grates on me because, it's a trial lawyer commercial.
Yeah.
So he's saying, "This is owed me." And you almost say, "Man, just sit down."
Yeah. So, a very self-absorbed mentality. Even if it's true, it's my money, and if something's ours, we want it, and it makes sense in our minds. Nobody else should have it. It's mine, But that attitude that's being portrayed is the main issue here, and the motivation for him doing this in the first place. So not only does he say one of the most profound things that we can find in any literature ever written in verse 15, one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. That sounds like something you would find in a fortune cookie or something. Ever since fortune cookies don't even have fortunes anymore, they just have whatever they are. Proverbs always lets me down because I want a fortune, even though it's totally worthless. But one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So true, so profound, yet the fact that it's so obvious and profound at the same time is kind of a paradox in itself because we don't think about it like that very often. Many times our mentalities and our attitudes show that we're not keeping that principle in mind. So he follows that up by telling a parable. This is the parable of the rich fool. It's one of three in a more or less a series of parables about that are really warnings. And this is the one about the rich, usually called the parable of the rich fool. And here's what he says. The land of a rich man, this is beginning of verse 16, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, or you fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you've prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. All right, so this rich man. Now think about those questions we asked at the beginning. Is there anything wrong with success? Is there anything wrong with wanting to be successful? Is there anything wrong with being famous even? Although there are many, many things that go along generally with the culture of celebrity that we have created here in the Western world, and maybe not even in the Western world, but we have certainly taken it to a whole new level in modern times, the last century or so especially. But fame itself, Jesus was famous. There's no getting around that. I've never been anywhere where so many thousands of people gathered around me. Ever. Never will. Jesus was famous, period. Now, is there anything wrong with success and fame and abundance. Well, that's the question that we might ask in considering this parable, because we might stop and think, what exactly is Jesus saying here? What is the problem? What's the problem here? He was a farmer, it says. He had land, he had crops, but he had a lot of crops. One harvest, it seems, the harvest, the crop was much more plentiful than normal or than expected. And so this man became quite a successful farmer. And, depending on how successful you are as a farmer, I guess you're going to become a pretty successful businessman as well, because you're going to be presumably doing things with the crops that you're growing and not just growing them for yourself. So he became very successful and wealthy. And he had so many crops, in excess even, not in the bad sense of that word, but just he had extra, overabundance. He started to think to himself, as we all do, and as we all probably would in his situation. He asked the right question too. What shall I do? I'm running out of room. I already have run out of room. I don't have anywhere to put. Now I've got my barns that I've always had, but I've got all this extra. I don't know what to do with it. What should I do? And he said, I got it. I'll tear down the barns I've got. I'll build all new barns. Brand new barns, larger barns, so that I'll have somewhere to store up all these crops. And I think the implication is that harvest and crop is going to be continually abundant in this way, plentiful. So the idea is the more crops he gets, the more he's going to make provision to store all of them. Now again, whenever we look at this, we may be scratching our heads saying, okay, again, what did this man do wrong? What's wrong with this picture?
It's like that saying, though, you can't take it with you, and he was like hoarding it up, is what the impression I get. And it's kind of like, for what? To hoard all that up, just, he could have shared it with other people. I mean, he could have kept some of it.
Yeah, there are other options.
With you. Some people hoard up things like that, knowing that it's not, in the end, it's not going to.
Yeah, before we try to jump to the defense of this man in a maybe self-reflective way, we have to keep in mind what the principle is that sparked this parable. Beware, take care, and be on your guard against all covetousness. And then he told him a parable. And then he said, one's life doesn't consist in the abundance of what he has. Then he told him a parable to illustrate what he's just said. So from before the parable even starts, and before we're even told about this rich man, Jesus has already told us that this rich man was covetous and apparently was considering his life to consist in the abundance of his possessions. So we can't defend this man. What we do need to do is determine what he did wrong, other than those two things. Well, here we see, besides those things, here's what stands out to me. The excessive use of first-person pronouns. What shall I do? 1, for I have nowhere to store my crops. I will do this. I will tear down my barns, build larger ones, and I will store all my grain, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I'll say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So there's at least 11 times he says, I and my. It's just saturated. And I think in that, we see a little bit of where this man's heart is and his attitude. It's all about him. It's all about me. What shall I do? Now, we know this wasn't a real man. This is a parable that Jesus is telling. So it's not like this man had a history. But still, the implication is this abundance this is a new thing that had started to happen. So all of his life of farming, he was okay with what he had. the barns he had and the harvest and crops that he had. So now that all of a sudden he's got all this extra, some people would take that and say, wouldn't even have to ask what I should do with this, because they're going to say, I'm going to give this away. I'm going to give this to some people. I'll give this to the poor. I'll give this to people who need it. But surely he's got some family, friends. Hey, y'all want some corn? Or, y'all like whatever his crops are. Probably not corn in that part of the world, but I don't know. Whatever they would typically harvest, surely somebody could use it. Wheat.
He's saying also, basically his goal is just to eat, drink, and be merry.
Yeah, that's the other condemning part. So,
It's bad to do that, but that's like his whole goal.
nothing wrong with relaxing. Nothing wrong with eating. This is an attitude, though. This is a way of life. This is a lifestyle. So the most condemning part is verse 19. But still, verse 18, while there's nothing inherently sinful about expanding a business enterprise, it's the spirit and attitude that we have to take into consideration. What shall I do? Oh, I know what I'll do. So there's nobody else anywhere in his mind, including, most importantly, God, as Jesus indicates at the end. So, he says, I'll tear down my barns. I think that's maybe the most extreme part of the parable. He doesn't just build new barns. That's what I would have concluded, Well, my barns are filled up. I still have a lot. I need to build another barn. He's going to tear down his barns and build all new barns, all bigger barns. But he may have needed to tear them down. He may not have had enough space to build new ones in addition to the ones he had. But still, it's all selfishly motivated. He lacked a sense of values. He was selfish. And he was self-satisfied. And that's what we see in verse 19. After I've torn down my barns and built new barns, bigger barns, and got all my goods laid up, or after I've stored all my grain and my goods in there, then here's what I'll do. I will say to my soul, soul, you ever say anything to your soul? I like this part. I'll say to my soul, soul, you got all kinds of goods laid up. It's going to last you for years. You're not going to have to plant and harvest for a long time because of how much you have now or will have once you've finished this job, finished this task. So relax. Sit back, kick back, eat, drink, and be merry.
We all know that's not good for yourself, really.
Yeah, it's not good for your mind, or it's not good for your mind, your body, or your soul, or anything.
Business thing was he thought he was in control, and you never know what's going to happen from one year to the next.
Yeah, maybe.
Horrible in the next 10 years for all he knew.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he already built his big barns, and now has nothing to put in, and he has no money, and it's just God's in control. We aren't. We think we are, but
Yeah, there's a lot of things he didn't take into consideration of potential downfalls, What if somebody came in and stole all his grain? Now, he spent all his money, or a very large portion of his money it would cost, I'm sure, to tear down your barns and build new ones. He doesn't have to worry about harvesting for a while because he's got all the goods laid up. What if somebody came in and burned down his barns? What if somebody stole his goods? What if there are plenty of earthly things that could happen that his whole venture would come crashing down? He didn't even apparently stop to think about that. Or there's an even bigger thing to think about, which is where verse 20 comes in. The end of the man's part of this parable is eat, drink, be merry. If you remember the Old Testament passage, And it's become pretty much an expression today. Eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die, you know. Something along those lines, to paraphrase.
But he also never did thanks to God for all that he had. He never showed gratitude or appreciation or, I know where all my blessings flow from. There's no, he's talking to himself because self did it.
Yeah.
Self, hey soul, we did a good job. Now we are, he took the, providential hand of God taking care of everything, the rain, everything that you are required to have those crops. I mean, they don't magically appear. There's nothing you can do to make that happen.
Yeah.
You can't grow that on your own, but he had such a lack of, where did it come from? Basis. He did that, so
Yeah.
the selfishness also then was to an ungrateful heart and
Yeah.
had no love for God and the fact that I can do this now, because we were actually talking about the hoarders type people.
Yeah.
And I said, my dad grew up very poor, one of 10, had nothing. You didn't throw stuff away if you could reuse it later, or if someone else might need it. So in today's standard, there's those people who are very minimalist. They use it, they throw it away, they don't want clutter, And then you have the opposite end of, what else could I use that for on down the road, because we might not have anything. So you have those people that hold on to things because they don't know what the future holds, but not in a selfish way like he was being selfish,
Yeah.
Theirs is a self-preservation from a time they went through where they had nothing.
Yep.
And then you have those others that are just so, we'll throw it all away because we, can't be bothered with it. So it's not that kind of attitude. I see that a lot, the gratefulness or the ungratefulness of it all. You didn't even thank God for,
Yeah.
God, what would you have me to do? Should I donate it? Should I give it to the people? Should I, you'll provide for me later. I don't need to store it.
Yeah, what would God want? And God is nowhere in his mind or heart, so it's all about him. It's the exact opposite of David, when he had all this excess because people had donated to the temple, and he immediately, and in fact, it's not even immediately, he already had God in his mind and heart, so that when all this was donated, he just spills out to God in prayer, thanking God for all this, all these riches and things that we have to donate to the building of your house. They came from you. Thank you. We're so happy that you've given us all this so that we can give you all of this back, and so on and so forth. And that's the exact opposite also of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel, when he goes out and he says, look at my kingdom that I have gotten for myself. Look at all this. The boundaries of my kingdom, and God really made an example of him for that. So God's not in his mind and heart, and he's going to be answered. Yep.
I'm just looking in the context, in the ESV, it uses anxious 4 times in this chapter, 19 of the New Testament, but 4 times. And this man is almost an example of that anxiety. And I had thought it in that context.
Yeah.
That when there's that, we talk about anxiety attacks, but when there's that feeling of being unsatisfied, it's hard to describe it, but I guess anxious is anxious about
Yeah.
something.
It's a type of anxiousness. Yeah.
Settle back. God is in control.
Yeah, God's in control. So like Stacy mentioned, there's extremes. You can find sin in either side of the extremes. Those who are more frugal or whatever, and to the extreme that God can be left out in that too, like not relying on God and things like that. Or the opposite extreme, where you're not respecting, you're lacking respect in other ways, or care and being anxious about other things.
Stacy's, talking about her dad, there was a meme that was going around about bacon grease and aluminum foil, how there was a generation that those things were, and we always had a crock of bacon grease, available, so that you had that.
That's not something you throw away.
Yeah, exactly.
You hang on to that.
You can use that, and aluminum foil. I mean, you just go through that generation, and from their standpoint, or from the standpoint of the Depression, there was, if it could be used, you keep it.
Mhm.
But from our generation, I sort of look at it like, that's a lot of time. That's, but
Yep.
And the saddest part of all this to me is like, in all of it, it ended up being his last day, and he didn't have his soul right with God.
He had never thought of that, never stopped to consider that. Think about how careful he was being about his material things. Where is the indication anywhere in this parable, anything in what he said or did, that shows any sort of concern or preparation for what comes after this life? None. Nothing. Even though he spoke to his soul, he said, I'll say to my soul, soul, you better be careful, because when your body dies, you're going to be living still, but you'll be somewhere. No, he didn't say anything like that. So you might want to take care about, what God might think about what you do or what God would want you to do. Nothing like that. And so that's really where the climax comes, is when God said to him, in verse 20. On the surface, we may not see anything wrong with what this man did without more thought. But then all of a sudden, God says to him, you fool. First words, you fool. So there's one thing that was wrong with what he did in itself. At least God considered what he did to be foolish. So there's, again, no defense for this man, really. But this is the big reason why. Because tonight, your soul is going to be required of you. And all these things that you've prepared to do, you got all these plans. You're going to tear down your barns, build bigger ones, and then store everything up, and then get to kick back and relax. Be married for a few years. Just sitting around. All those big plans you made. All that abundance of crops and goods and money. Whose will they be? And that's the end of the parable, really. It's a rhetorical question. And the answer is obvious. Not yours. I don't know whose they'll be, but they won't be his, will they? That's one of the things that Ecclesiastes talks about. Of course, it's from a slightly skewed viewpoint, intentionally or not intentionally. His idea is, what's the point of having anything? Because your no good, worthless sons are going to either get it when you die, and who knows what they'll do with it, or else, you're not going to be able to take it with you, so what's the point of having anything? Just like he said, what's the point of being righteous? Righteous people die all the time. Wicked people die. If you're too wicked, you'll die. If you're too righteous, you'll die. So what's the point of being wicked? Don't be too wicked and don't be too righteous. Not good advice, really, from that perspective. But what's the point of having anything? Because you can't take it with you when you're going to die and you can't take it. That's the thing that this man didn't stop to consider. And he never would have thought in a million years that night was the night that he was going to be faced with that reality, the hard way. He's going to have to learn it the hard way. And Jesus is telling us a story about somebody who had to learn it the hard way, so we don't have to learn it the hard way. We can learn it the easy way, or the easier way. Oh, I don't want that to be me. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be in that man's position. Thank you, Jesus, for telling us this, because now I can try to not be in the same position as that man. And yet, there's countless millions of souls who will find themselves in the exact position of that man. No thought for eternity, no thought for the hereafter. Selfishness, self-satisfaction, self. That's really this man's big stumbling block, was himself. It was himself. So, yeah.
Just know that. I mean, people have to teach you that. Somebody has to teach you about your soul and going to heaven and hell and all that. If nobody teaches them that, they're never going to think it or even know anything about it.
Yeah, the world
Our job is to teach
teaches people things all the time. It's unavoidable.
then they're never gonna know.
Yeah, that's not one of the things that the world teaches people. You know, all kinds of stuff the world teaches, like eat, drink, be merry. You know, that's something the world teaches. But one thing the world doesn't teach is your soul and the value of it and the destination of it, the nature of it, the destination of it. God has taught that.
Just like him, people nowadays don't know either.
Yeah, and they may not know it. They may not accept it. You know, but thankfully we don't have to learn it the way this man did. And the application he makes to the parable is, this is how the one is who lays up treasure for himself, and yet he's not rich toward God. There's the man. That sums up this man. What did this man do? This is what he did. He laid up treasure for himself. He was all kinds of rich, earthly, in an earthly sense. Spiritually, none. He was not rich toward God. He wasn't anything toward God except disrespectful and totally negligent. So, other lessons we can learn from this whole text here. Don't worry about the material things of this life. There he goes on again, like Jay mentioned. Anxious is, I see it at least, 3 or 4 times here in this little opening here in the following verses, 22 through 34, similar to what he's already taught in Matthew 6. But don't be anxious. Don't worry about these material things. Worry about, for lack of a better word, the spiritual things. Because life is not about what you have materially. It's about something deeper, something bigger, something greater, spiritual things. And then he ends with this same thought that he said back in Matthew 6, Sermon on the Mount. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. Wherever that treasure is where your heart's going to be every time, no matter what. That's an unchanging rule. Your heart will be wherever your treasure is. So, we may really be confused about I don't know where my heart is. Where is my heart? Well, it's wherever your treasure is. So where's my treasure? It's easier to find out where a treasure is than it may be where a heart is. Where's my treasure? It still takes a lot of self-reflection and honesty, Look at my pattern of life. Look at what I've got going on in my life. That'll tell you where your treasure is. And then take Jesus' word for it, that wherever that is where your heart will be. And that's why we need to be careful about where our treasure is. That man's treasure was in his field and in his barns. So that's where his heart was. And he did nothing for God, had no riches toward God. And so God calls him a fool, because now God's going to require his soul of him. He's not going to require him to have big barns to keep all his grain, or huge barns full of grain. That's not what's going to be required of him. What's going to be required of him is a soul, and he killed his soul by neglecting it utterly and completely.